Hey, welcome back to Whitetail Garage. We are going to do the fuel system today. Hopefully the full install. Let me see how much we can get done. But got to get organized first and get everything pulled off the shelf and kind of over onto the workbench and see what all we've got and then build a game plan. All right, so we've got everything organized here. This is everything that came in the box. I did an unboxing video. If you haven't seen it, I'll link it up top. But next, we got to get into the fuel tank and get the bracket for the fuel level sensor. Get all that bolted up. So this is Aeromotive's fuel tank. So it's supposed to bolt right into the car without having to do the modification for the filler neck, and you still get the baffling and everything for running the fuel hat. That's what the inside of the tank looks like. Fuel level sending unit from LMR. Just a factory replacement. Right here and right here were some melted plastic tabs. So I just took a pair of pliers and crushed them to be able to pull it apart. And then you just pull back on that tab. It's not going to focus. Pull back on that tab and then it pops out. So now we do the reverse over here. Like so. There we go. So I was just looking, and these are the two wires for your fuel level sending unit. And they're actually like basically permanent on the bottom of the pump. So not that you'll take it out often, but anytime this pump has to come out, so does the fuel level sending unit once this is wired, or I got to cut it and redo it every time. Not a huge fan of that. That and the connectors that hold it in, these will go here, here, and on this side. 3 different places to hold it into the bracket down there. And these are the kind of connectors that they have some teeth that won't exactly want to come back apart. So just an observation. Not a huge fan of that, but that's what they give you. That's what you should use. Has the heat shrink on it. All right, next is go in with it. So I'm gonna see if I can get a better camera angle for you while it's going in. We'll go from there. That one was a pain, and I dropped it. Alright, so here's all the fittings that came in the box. So 145, then the rest are 90s and some straights. O-rings for all of these style fittings. All right, so I was just laying out the fittings just to see, make sure I've got everything, make sure it's right. So out of the fuel tank, then into these fittings, hose into this fitting, through the filter, through the Y block, into the fuel rails, which I have those fittings over here with them. Then out of the fuel rails, into the regulator, down into this fitting, hose in between these two, this fitting down by the tank, which will be right next to these fittings, so it's nice and easy to remove the tank. But then from here, back into the tank. So that's all the fittings. So that's what we're working towards. We're going to put the fuel filter, mount it in the spot they recommend, and that'll give you 2 points to disconnect, because you're going to run a short line to that fitting for the return, and that gives you 2 points to disconnect right there and be able to drop the tank out. So that's what we're working on now. All right, ready to go in the car with the fuel tank. Got all the seals in, brand new seals for the vapor valve and the filler neck. Got this installed. I used one of these clamps that it comes with right here off the bracket. That way I could create this. So fuel lines will attach here after it's in the tank. That's actually by design from Aeromotive. That's a really smart idea. Put the pads on, new pads on the tank. Pulled the harness. I went ahead and pulled the 2 pins that would normally drive the fuel pump. And now these just this harness left to plug right into the factory for the fuel fill. Then created a new harness for the power and ground. So those will run once I get into the car. I'll terminate those where I feel like they're supposed to go. But otherwise, it's all set. I'll tell you one piece of negative feedback. I found it kind of interesting, but the stud that these bolt to on all 4 of these tried spinning inside the housing, so I was not impressed with that. You couldn't really tighten it down very much, so I wanted to make sure I got Loctite on them. All right, we're going to get it in the vehicle and move on with the rest of the fuel lines.
Hang on. You want me to go up?
All right, tank is in. We had to use longer bolts though to make that work. All right, guys, back out in the garage. It's a new day today. Still working on putting the fuel system in. Right, we got quite a bit done yesterday. Got the regulator mounted in the corner, and then I put the fuel pressure gauge, rather than being on the regulator itself, I put it on the cowl, and I've got it teed to that fuel pressure gauge that I can read inside the cab, so that way I can see both, one while I'm under the hood adjusting fuel pressure, the other while I'm driving. But so we've got most of the, or at least got the tank is mounted. We did that yesterday, and got the lines run from the front to the back. The return line is already done. It's terminated on both ends and already hooked up to the regulator. The feed line, however, is not cut yet, because I don't know exactly where that Y block is going to go yet. I want to finish out. I'm going to do the return lines from the rails to the regulator, and then do the feed lines from the Y block to the rails, just depending on how much is left. I don't know how long or where that Y block needs to be, because I only have a certain amount. But next, I wanted to show you guys how I'm cutting the hoses, the stainless hose. It's kind of difficult to do, and so I want to just show you the way that I'm doing it. I've tried the tape method that most people do, and on the 8AN line that was just fine, no issues. But on the 6AN line, the return line and the feed line to the rails, I guess the particular braid on that is real easily unwound. so it frays super easy, and it's actually a really strong wire. So just the tape that's on there, it's kind of fraying even with the tape on there. So what I've found is to use some ring clamps, and I've heard of people doing this, but I found this to be really effective. So let me just show you. I've got my mark that I've just made with a Sharpie where I want to cut, and I'm going to put on either side of it, I'm going to put 2 small ring clamps, just little ring clamps. All right, 2 ring clamps installed, nice and snug, and I'm going to run a big right angle grinder with a cutoff disc. I'm going to run that right in between those 2. You can see it's a pretty straight cut, hardly any burring at all. And then I don't know if you can notice, I'm actually kind of sandwiched down on this hose. It's actually squeezing down the hose a little bit. And that's to make sure it stays actually a little bit smaller than the number 6 fitting. Now this next step that I do is where I really found it made everything much easier. So let me show you. Key step, make sure you've got oil inside this fitting right here. Just a tiny bit to lubricate the inside. Make sure it slips. Then here, like I said before, I've got this actually crunched down a little bit. So the end of this hose is actually a little bit smaller than this opening, which means it fits in there very easily. And then the trick here that I've found is with it clamped in a vise, right? This is solid in the vise. I'm pushing up against this while I loosen the clamp. And see how it slides right on there? Get the clamp completely off. The hose is in there, it's all the way up against the base. So now it's just a matter of, which by the way, these jaws are kind of a pain to work with, but these are inexpensive jaws I got off of Amazon. Aluminum jaws for AN fittings. Alright, and then I like to just a little drop of oil on the rubber inside there, just a tiny bit, and then of course a little bit of oil both on the threads and here. Again, it doesn't take much, just a little bit. And from what I've read, you can use, you know, assembly oil. This is just straight 30 motor oil. So then I also recommend getting a decent wrench. This is, again, was a cheap one off of Amazon, and it works just fine. I actually kind of like it. I mean, I'd love to have a good set of open-end ANs, but for as often I'm putting fuel systems together or taking them apart, I didn't see a need for buying a whole set. So this is just one wrench I can throw in, and then if I ever have to take 1 or 2 fittings off, then I've got the right one for all of it. So, but the trick on this part is just make sure that you're, watch the hose as you're turning while you're holding it, making sure that as the fitting is going in, it's not backing out the hose. There you go. And these are swivel 90s that come with this kit. A lot of people say not to use them because there's an O-ring in here that can go bad. All right, last day of the fuel system install. Yesterday, got all the fuel lines run under the hood, and today, really the only thing left is to strap the fuel lines to the frame rail in the back and get them connected, and then wire the fuel pump. I don't know that we'll get to wiring the fuel pump in this video, we'll see, but I want to at least get that buttoned up, and then I'll take you for a tour on everything that I did with the fuel system. We'll go back and look at all the connectors that I used and the spots that I used them, because I don't think I did it necessarily the way the instructions tell you to do it. I'm not sure, but and then I'll show you how much line I have left over, just so you get an idea if you're doing this on your car. So next, let's jump onto the back. Okay, now I'm going to try and show you the routing. It's kind of hard because I have to be so close, but coming from the top of the tank, just as the instructions show, I bring them to the fuel filter and to this connector. I went ahead and used one of the straps here on this bolt. Works good, just barely catches the nylon, so it works. It's still got the lock washer going. And that's where they both connect. And so then I went over this, or behind the back of the strap. That's the fuel tank strap. Ran them behind there, and then strapped along the fuel rail all the way to going through the subframe connector. So the subframe connector I've got here, it's just a 2x2 by 1/8 inch square tubing that's welded to each end of the subframe. And so the ends are open. That allows me to pass my battery on one side and my fuel on the other side. So let me get up and I'll show you how I routed it in the front. Again, other end of the subframe connector. Comes out of the subframe connector. I've got it strapped to the bottom of that rail coming up. Strapped here as well. Actually, squeeze that a little closer together. And then going through not the factory hole that's there, because I've got my, hidden in the fender harness routed that through there. So it's not going through the factory hole, but I've drilled a new hole, and then I put this padding around it, so that way it can go straight through. Then the fuel pressure gauge, which I'll show in a minute, it comes out of the cowl right here, and then that goes to the factory, which is to come out here where I've mounted the regulator. And so there's the two fuel lines that come up, and then following the feed, the Y is right behind here. It's really hard to see, but the Y is right behind there. It Y's out to the back of both the fuel rails. Then one fuel rail comes out here and then just loops back to the regulator. The other fuel rail underneath, and then comes around the backside and hits the regulator. And then again, you return back to the tank coming out of the bottom of the regulator. So fuel pressure gauge is coming out of here, going into the cowl and coming around to this, where I've got a fitting that's 4 AN on either side, and then the 1/4 inch thread for this to thread onto, because I'm also running fuel to that gauge over there. So that one I could see from inside the car, this one I could see from under the hood. So that's the routing. So for now, I just have all these done like this, but what I'll do is I've got some clamps on the way. I'll show them right now. Are going to organize this much better, keep it up and out of the way of the exhaust there, because I don't want it to get too much heat from the exhaust. So everybody seems to have questions about the routing, and I couldn't find a whole lot of answers, especially on the fuel routing over the axle to try and stay away from the exhaust. Most everybody's answer is, I just followed the factory fuel lines. Well, my factory fuel lines were cut out a long time ago and had a different fuel system similar to this one. And it's been so long, I don't remember exactly how that one was routed. And so I was trying to stay away from the exhaust tip. But as you can see, I think I did a pretty good job of routing it over the, following the frame rail over the axle, and then routing it back behind that strap to keep it protected. One thing I was going to show you is how much I have left over routing it the way that I routed it. 5 feet, 6, and maybe 4 feet of 8 is about what I have left there. And then I have all of their connectors left over, because that's one thing that I haven't finished the wiring, so that's why that breaker and relay are still in there. I'll use the breaker and relay, but their connectors, don't use those. Make sure you go out and get you a kit that has the heat shrink on each one, because that's just going to make that connection that much more solid. So that's really my only complaint about the system, is the fittings that they send for the electrical fittings. Yeah. All right, if you have any questions about my setup or how I routed it, just drop me a comment. I'll be sure to reply to it. Otherwise, leave a like. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.